The sun dipped low behind the hills of Elcombe, bathing the narrow lanes in a dim orange glow, the kind that made the hedgerows look like they were whispering. Along the old stone path near the chapel, Miss Jane Marple walked her familiar route, cane in one hand, a small paper bag of toffees in the other. It was meant to be a peaceful evening, the sort one spends listening to bird calls and the distant chime of supper bells. But peace, like flowers, does not always bloom where it should. She had nearly passed Wren House when she saw it, the gate, that rusted iron gate, sealed shut since the late Mississippi Philippa Lane was laid to rest, now hung crooked on its hinges. Not wide open, not enough to welcome, just a sliver. Enough to be noticed, enough to be wrong. Miss Marple paused, letting the stillness settle around her like dust in sunlight. The house beyond the gate was unchanged, its ivy-laced facade slumped with age, its windows dimmed by years of neglect. Nothing stirred, no light, no sound, but the gate had moved, and that, in this village, was noise enough. Wren House had always been an oddity. Tucked between the chapel yard and the woods, it had once been elegant. Mississippi Philippa Lane, a botanist of quiet brilliance and sharp temper, had lived there alone for decades, with only her orchids and her secrets for company. After her death, the property had been locked and left untouched, her estate tangled in minor legalities, her belongings boxed by unseen hands. No relatives came. No one mourned publicly. It was as if she had vanished into the ground, like a bulb never blooming again. Miss Marple did not enter. She stood for a moment, long enough to be certain it was not a trick of light or shadow. The gate was ajar. There were no fresh footprints, no tire tracks on the drive, but the ivy had been parted, delicately, recently, as if someone knew just how to step without leaving a mark. She turned then, slowly, the image of the gate etched behind her eyes. She said nothing to the grocer on the way back, nor to Mrs. Weatherby, who waved from her front stoop. Some things are better considered in silence, Miss Marple believed, especially things that shouldn't move, but do. That night, as she folded her shawl and poured herself a modest glass of warm milk, she thought of Philippa Lane, not the woman, but the way she used to walk the village lanes in the evening. Always alone, always with a purpose. Some people live like locked rooms, and when the doors to such rooms open, unexpectedly, they rarely do so without reason. Miss Marple watched the moon rise over the chapel roof, a quiet breath escaping her lips. Something had returned to Wren House, but whether it was a person, a memory, or a shadow, she could not yet say. Not yet. The morning after the gate incident broke with a clean sky, the kind Elcombe villagers call honest weather. Cloudless blue, without the heaviness that often drapes itself over old secrets. Miss Marple rose early, not of habit, but anticipation. She had not dreamed of Wren House, but it had lingered nonetheless, in the texture of her toast, the clink of her spoon, the particular quietness of her sitting room. Silence, she knew, is rarely empty. By 9:30, she made her way to St. Agnes Church for the charity morning. A few tables stood beneath the archway, jars of jam, knitted scarves, second-hand books, and the vicar's wife cheerfully encouraged passers-by to try the seed cake before the rain finds us. It was there, near the table of old hymnals, that Miss Marple first noticed him. The stranger was tall, not young, not old, and dressed in a coat a little too well fitted for a man without an address. His shoes bore no mud, his cuff was newly pressed, and he studied the items on the table with a focus that was too careful to be natural. He did not speak to anyone, didn't sample the jam or ask about the bake sale. He only picked up a small, faded book titled The Medicinal Language of Orchids and examined its spine with such care that Miss Marple, who had seen many a pickpocket, many a grieving man, and many a liar, felt something colder than curiosity rise in her. She approached without preamble. "You have a taste for rare plants, I see." He looked up. His eyes were polite, but his voice was rehearsed. "Only a passing interest. My aunt was fond of botany." "Your aunt?" she repeated lightly. "How interesting. May I ask which one?" He smiled. "You wouldn't know her. Died some years ago. Reclusive sort. Lived in Sussex." Miss Marple tilted her head. Not Mississippi Philippa Lane, by any chance? The name landed with the quietest impact, but she saw it. In his jaw. In the eyes that flickered too quickly. He recovered fast. No, he said. Different person entirely. He placed the orchid book back with a kind of reverence and gave a small nod. Lovely village you have here. Then he walked off. No purchase, no conversation. Just a coat brushing the tables like a shadow on silk. Miss Marple watched him go. He didn't look back once. But she noticed how he glanced at the church tower, then the woods behind it, then, ever so briefly, toward the distant roof of Wren House, just visible above the hedgerow. He wasn't from around here, but he had been before, and whatever he had come to find, Miss Marple suspected it wasn't jam or orchids. By that afternoon, the wind had shifted. A light rain began, the kind that sounds like secrets tapping at the windows. Miss Marple returned to her sitting room, teacup steaming, and thought about the stranger, about the gate, about a house filled with silence and a name dropped too easily. Wren House had opened, and someone with polished shoes and a false aunt, had come to see what lay beyond the threshold. But Elcombe was not a village where the past lay still, and Miss Marple had never liked strangers who knew too much about local plants. Evening settled on Elcombe with a hush that seemed more deliberate than peaceful, as though the village itself was holding its breath. Street lamps blinked to life one by one, casting long shadows across garden gates and cobblestones. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting untouched in her lap, her thoughts returning again and again to Wren House and the stranger with the too careful hands. Something about his presence had stirred the air around the old estate, like wind through dry leaves. The following day, under the pretense of returning a borrowed book, Miss Marple made her way to Mill Lane. There, in a modest brick cottage with rose-colored curtains, lived Mrs. Celia Grafton, the former housekeeper of Wren House. Celia was retired now, her knees no longer suited for scrubbing, and her memory both sharp and selective. She greeted Miss Marple warmly and ushered her inside, her niece away at work, the kettle already singing. "It's strange," Celia murmured, pouring tea. "How often people bring up that house now. For years no one mentioned it, not after poor Mississippi Lane passed. And now, well, the gate open, and strangers asking questions." "Strangers?" Miss Marple inquired, gently. Celia hesitated. "A man came about a month ago. Said he was Miss Lane's nephew, though she never spoke of any family. Asked to collect some personal things. Said he had authority, though he didn't show any paper. Only stayed a moment, took a box from the East Room, then left." "The East Room," Miss Marple repeated, eyes narrowing. "Oh, yes." Celia nodded, a shiver running through her. Miss Lane's sanctuary. No one was ever allowed in there. She said the light was special. It faced the morning sun, you see. She kept orchids there. Exotic things I never could name. All wild-looking and pale. Wouldn't let me water them. Said they were sensitive. And now, well, Celia said, stirring sugar into her tea, though she'd never taken it sweet before, there's no one left to say who belongs to what. Miss Marple sipped quietly, gaze drifting to the window. The East Room. A man with no surname. A plant sanctuary sealed from the world. Later, on her slow walk home, Miss Marple passed Wren House again. Its high windows were dark. Ivy now strangled the corners of the east side, but above the shuttered glass of that very room, something caught her eye. Not movement. Reflection. A shimmer of green, a leaf? No, something more vibrant, like the edge of a petal that shouldn't bloom this time of year. Orchids, she thought. Wild, pale, and somehow still alive. Wren House was supposed to be empty, but something inside was growing, or waiting. Miss Marple turned away, the wind colder now, brushing against her collar like breath on the nape of her neck. She did not look back, because some rooms, she knew, didn't forget, and some memories, like orchids, bloom long after the gardener is gone. The following morning dawned gray, the kind of dull sky that flattened all color and made even familiar places feel slightly wrong. Miss Marple dressed without haste, her movements precise, her mind heavier than her footsteps. The questions circling her thoughts were not yet accusations, only quiet uncertainties gathering shape. She carried them with her to the village charity shop, as she often did on slow mornings. It was not curiosity that led her there, but something older and more persistent, a sense, perhaps, that forgotten things have a habit of revealing what the living choose to hide. Inside the shop, the scent of mothballs mingled with lavender soap. Miss Marple exchanged polite words with Mrs. Grinby, who presided over the till with her usual absent-minded cheer. Then, with a practiced eye, she drifted to the back shelves, the ones rarely dusted and even more rarely touched. There, wedged between a cracked atlas and a stringless mandolin, sat a modest cardboard box. It wasn't the box that caught her eye. It was what lay atop it. Pale blue stationery, the kind once used for personal letters. Miss Marple lifted the lid gently. Most of the pages were blank, but 4 sheets, just 4, were written upon in a looping, unfamiliar script. There's poison in beauty. The wren sings only when watched. Roots hold secrets better than stone. I am not afraid to be buried where I bloomed. She read them twice, then a third time. There was no signature, no date, only a thin trace of scent, barely perceptible, lavender, or perhaps something more peculiar, like crushed bark or dried sap. She purchased the box without a word. Back at Honeysuckle Cottage, she pulled out an old postcard from a drawer in her writing desk. A thank you from Mississippi Philippa Lane, sent years ago after a lecture on ancient roses. The handwriting was spidery, narrow, slanted to the right. She held it beside the anonymous pages. Not the same. Who, then, had written these strange phrases? And why leave them in a charity shop, where chance alone would decide their fate? Miss Marple laid the pages beside her teacup and stared at the words. They didn't read like musings, nor were they poetic in the typical sense. They were declarations, perhaps even instructions, a warning in code. Later that afternoon, she took them to Dr. Crawley, the local apothecary, who kept a discreet air and an encyclopedic knowledge of herbs both benign and lethal. These aren't mere metaphors, he murmured after reading the lines. They reference properties, chemical, botanical, alkaloids, if I'm not mistaken. Look here, this line about poison and beauty, that's classic monkshood, and this about roots could be referencing aconite. Dangerous stuff, if you know how to extract it. Miss Marple folded the notes and slipped them back into her handbag. Are you suggesting, she asked quietly, that someone in Elkham has been studying such things? He looked at her over the rim of his glasses. I'm suggesting someone already has. Miss Marple thanked him with a gracious nod, but her mind was far from gracious now. She walked home beneath gathering clouds, the blue stationery pressing cold against her side, like a heartbeat wrapped in paper. By the time she reached her gate, rain had begun to fall in a fine, slanting mist. She stood there a moment before going inside. A wren sang from the hedge, just once, and then was silent. She did not smile, because sometimes birds sing not for joy, but for witness. And sometimes what we find in forgotten boxes is not just a trace of the past, but the beginning of a reckoning. The air held a peculiar stillness that morning, as if the village itself had paused mid-thought. The annual church fair had set up on the green, a modest affair with bunting fluttering weakly in the breeze, and stalls lined with preserves, baked goods, and flowers arranged with more hope than skill. Miss Marple arrived just past 11, her straw hat tilted against the pale sun, and her curiosity sharpened by the unanswered questions left trailing like threads through her thoughts. It was by the rose stall that she saw him, a man neither entirely out of place, nor quite part of the scene. Tall, slim, dressed in a coat of good fabric that didn't belong to village dust, he stood as if waiting for something to reveal itself. His gaze lingered on the climbers, roses bred to reach high and cling stubbornly to stone. Miss Marple approached with a polite smile, her presence quiet but certain. "A fine morning," she offered. The man turned, his expression pleasant but unreadable. "It is," he said, tipping his hat. "I didn't expect roses to thrive this far inland." "Roses," Miss Marple said mildly, "are often stronger than they appear, particularly the hybrid varieties." Ah, he smiled. "I've always had an interest in rare plants. Something of a collector, you might say." She nodded. Collectors often have good memories. They must recall not only appearances but origins. The man didn't blink. True. I'm hoping to see Wren House while I'm here. I was told Mississippi Lane once cultivated unusual specimens there. Miss Marple's voice didn't waver. Mississippi Lane passed several years ago. The house has been closed since. Pity, he said softly. Some plants vanish when their keepers do. Others, she replied, find a way to outlive them. There was a beat of silence. He looked at her now, not quite suspiciously, but as if reassessing her role in the scene. He did not ask her name. She did not offer it. Instead, she turned toward the table of roses. This variety, she said, touching a bloom with the gentlest of fingers, was bred to survive in poor soil. Its thorns are deceptive, delicate in appearance, but sharper than most expect. I admire resilience, the man said. Yes, she agreed, though I've found those who admire it most are often the ones who've tried to test it. Their eyes met. A flicker passed between them, subtle, like wind shifting the petals on the table, but real. He stepped back, giving her a nod. Well then, perhaps we'll meet again. I imagine we might, Miss Marple said. Villages are like gardens, small, intricate, and full of surprises. The man walked away, his stride slow, measured. She watched him go, noting the cut of his coat, the polish of his shoes, the way he avoided eye contact with those around him. Finch, that was the name he'd given when introduced at the stall. A bird's name, like Wren. Miss Marple did not believe in coincidence. As the bell from the church tower struck noon, she turned her face toward the east, toward Wren House, toward the thorns that had begun to twist through memory, beauty, and the dark soil beneath them all. The key to Wren House, as expected, rested in a modest metal cabinet at the parish council hall, tucked between those to the church attic and the vestry storage closet, with a politely worded letter citing archival botanical interest and a subtle mention of mildew danger. Miss Marple obtained it without difficulty. She made no mention of the man called Finch. Not yet. The house stood beneath a heavy sky that threatened rain, but never quite delivered. Shutters clung to the windows like watchful eyelids, and ivy curled up the stone walls like nature, trying to crawl back inside. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the east wing, past a rusted trellis and a broken sundial, her footsteps careful against the uneven flagstone path. Inside, the air was thick with a silence that felt too old to disturb, sweet, sugary, and faintly stale. She entered the east room, the one Mississippi Philippa Lane had always kept sealed. Dust floated in a single beam of light pressing through a gap in the curtain. Along the windowsill stood several orchids, long thought dead. Most were collapsed in on themselves, their petals brown and brittle, but one leaned toward the light, fresh and unmistakably alive. Miss Marple approached slowly. Orchids should not have bloomed here, not after so long. It suggested someone had returned. She turned to the writing desk in the corner. Though the wood was cracked with age, the drawer slid open easily. Inside she found a collection of pressed petals, each delicately preserved and labeled by date. One entry read simply, F. March 1927. She closed the drawer and made her way down the old servants' corridor to the root cellar. Most in the village had forgotten it even existed. Built during the war, when cold storage meant the difference between scarcity and survival. The further she descended, the more the scent changed, stone and damp earth at first, then rust and something faintly metallic, almost like blood left too long in the air. At the far end, beneath a pile of overturned pots and rusted garden tools, she found a wooden box. Its iron hinges bore the scars of time, but the lock looked recently disturbed. It gave way with a soft snap. Inside were bones, small, delicate avian, arranged carefully in a ring of dried petals. Resting on top, folded and yellowing, was a note. Miss Marple unfolded it without hesitation. She trusted me. I failed her. There was no name, but the paper carried a familiar scent, lavender oil, fresh and lingering. It was the same perfume she'd smelled days earlier on the sleeve of the man who called himself Finch, the same scent that drifted from the east room's open window. The connection was no longer uncertain. She closed the box gently. Some roots grow straight. Others twist through stone, changing shape to survive. But some roots grow so deep, they do not bloom, they fester. Outside, a gust of wind stirred the ivy. Leaves fluttered in the garden like startled wings, and somewhere close by, a bird sang a single, trembling note. It didn't sound like mourning. It sounded like warning. Miss Marple climbed the cellar steps, her lamp casting a flickering shadow along the corridor walls. The house had not revealed all its secrets, but it had begun to whisper, and she, as always, was listening. The morning began with rain, not the gentle kind that freshened the soil, but the kind that lingered in clouds long after the drops had stopped, pressing a hush over the village. Miss Marple sat near the window, snipping faded leaves from her rosebush, when a sudden prick from a thorn made her wince. A thin bead of blood welled at her fingertip. It was a small pain, brief and sharp, but it brought with it a memory. Years ago, Mississippi Philippa Lane had spoken of a thorned hybrid, a dangerous crossbreed between two wild rose varieties, unpredictable in bloom, violent in growth. The same rose now clung to the trellis by Miss Marple's window, too vibrant for its season, too wild for its nature. She returned inside and unfolded the cryptic notes she had found earlier, those strange poetic lines hidden in the pale blue stationery box. Each phrase, once mistaken for metaphor, now struck her differently. There's poison in beauty. Roots hold secrets better than stone. They weren't riddles. They were directions, or warnings. And if her instinct was correct, they were botanical. She slipped on her coat and carried the notes to the apothecary, Dr. Crawley, a mild-mannered man with a deep appreciation for rare plants and an even deeper respect for Miss Marple's quiet knowledge. "These aren't poems," he said after examining the papers. He tilted his glasses and looked again, this time tracing each line with a finger. "They're botanical observations, coded, perhaps, but accurate. Several mention alkaloids. One refers to the leaf pattern of aconitum. That's monkshood." "Deadly?" Miss Marple asked. He looked up. "Lethal. Even a small amount, absorbed through the skin or ingested, can stop a heart." Miss Marple's expression didn't change. She had long suspected as much, but confirmation always settled things more deeply than suspicion. Back at Honeysuckle Cottage, she brewed a weak cup of tea and sat with her thoughts. The pressed petals and the writing desk had not been chosen at random. Each was a record, a timestamp, a breadcrumb trail. The last entry, March 1927, labeled only F, was not a flower. It was a person. The name came back to her in a whisper, Finch. She recalled how the man at the church fair had stood too quietly, spoken too politely, and avoided her gaze when Philippa Lane's name had been mentioned. She remembered the scent of lavender oil, delicate, deliberate, and fresh, like something applied not in memory but in performance. There was a story blooming between the petals and the silence. A betrayal, a theft, and a plant never meant to survive had taken root through both. As dusk settled over the village, Miss Marple lit a single lamp in her parlor and returned to the desk. The orchid in the east room, the bones in the cellar, the hybrid roses outside her window, they weren't accidents. They were traces of an experiment, perhaps even a final effort by Mississippi Lane to create something that could endure deception, survive abandonment. The thorn had drawn blood, but more than that, it had awakened memory. Miss Marple dipped her pen and began to write. She was close now, very close, and when gardens begin to speak, it is not wise to ignore them. The air outside Wren House hung thick that evening, heavier than weather alone could explain. Miss Marple, with her shawl drawn tightly across her shoulders, approached the old railway station where she had seen him before, the stranger with the quiet eyes and polite silence, known only as Mr. Finch. He stood once again by the rusted iron bench beneath the flickering lantern, his hands in the pockets of a coat too fine for the soil it now brushed against. Miss Marple watched him for a moment before stepping closer, her voice soft, measured, but unflinching. "She trusted you," she said. He didn't flinch, didn't turn. She tried to breed a plant that could survive betrayal, a flower strong enough to root itself through lies. He sighed, barely audible. "And you," she continued. You took her notes, her work. You took her trust. And when it all became too much, you left her behind. You left her to rot in that house, all while her orchids bloomed without witness." Finch said nothing. The light from the lantern swayed slightly as the wind shifted. Shadows stretched across the gravel at their feet. "You returned," she said. "Not for closure, not for grief. You came back to see what had been left, to see if anyone had claimed the last of her work." He finally turned then, his face pale and tired, his eyes not cruel, but deeply hollowed by something older than guilt. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I loved her." Miss Marple gave a small, sad smile, not one of comfort, but of clarity. "Then you should have stayed. You should have answered when she called." She pulled from her coat a single pressed petal, one of the many left behind in the East Room, and held it out. March 1927, she said. "Was that your farewell or hers?" He took the petal, stared at it, but said nothing. "She was dying," he finally murmured. I thought if I left, she'd be remembered for what she created, not for what she lost." Miss Marple's tone was gentler now, but no less firm. "She was never afraid of being forgotten, Mr. Finch. She was afraid of being erased." He closed his eyes. "And now the plant is gone," she continued. "Stolen by a so-called niece who never was. Sold to someone who has no idea it was grown from betrayal." He turned to her fully then, his voice cracking under the weight of it all. "It wasn't meant to end like this." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "No, but endings rarely ask our permission." Behind them, the wind stirred the ivy creeping along the station wall. Somewhere, a train passed in the distance, its whistle low and mournful, and in that silence between them, thick with unspoken apologies and things too late to mend, the weight of the past settled, not as punishment, but as truth. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to, because sometimes, Miss Marple knew, the most devastating reckoning is the one that speaks no louder than a breath. Weeks passed, and the village quieted once more, but the silence was uneasy, as if the wind itself had paused to listen for what might come next. Then, quite without warning, the plant reappeared, not in the East Room of Wren House, not in any garden in Elcombe, but in a prestigious botanical showcase held in London, featured in a lavish exhibit titled New Discoveries in Hybrid Flora. There it stood, tall, luminous, with a deep violet throat rimmed in blood-red veins. A plaque beneath it bore a fabricated Latin name and no attribution. There was no mention of Mississippi Philippa Lane, the woman who had cultivated it in shadows and silence. No acknowledgment of the mind, or the heartbreak, that had shaped its roots. When word of the exhibition reached Elcombe via a gardening journal left on the counter of the apothecary, Miss Marple said nothing aloud. But that evening, she removed a sheaf of notes from her desk drawer, notes penned in Philippa's unmistakable hand, delicate and looping, dated, signed. One page in particular carried a description of the very flower now on display in London, complete with crossbreeding ratios and cautionary observations. At the bottom, beneath the final line, was a simple, fading signature. P.L. March 1927. Miss Marple folded the page, placed it in an envelope, and addressed it to the organizers of the showcase. She did not add a letter. She made no threats. She simply let the truth speak for itself. Within a fortnight, quiet murmurs began to rise, among curators, among scholars, and then among the press. The mystery surrounding the hybrid's origin drew attention, then suspicion. Anonymous tips followed. The exhibit plaque was replaced with a provenance under review notice, and Miss Marple, watching from her garden with a cup of warm tea in hand, allowed herself the smallest smile, not of satisfaction, but of restoration. Sometimes, she knew, justice did not arrive in a courtroom. Sometimes it arrived through ink, through quiet pages carried by post, and through the simple, unrelenting presence of memory refusing to be rewritten. She never sought credit. She never needed to. Truth, she believed, did not crave applause, only light. And when given time and space, it always found a way to bloom. The gate to Wren House closed again, not with a clang but with a sigh, as though the house itself had exhaled. The new owners arrived quietly, a middle-aged couple from Dorset who claimed to have no interest in the property's history, only in its bones. Within weeks, the East Room was stripped of its shelving and vines. The orchids were tossed, the wallpaper removed, and the garden gutted. They said it smelled of mold. They said it held no warmth. They brought in contractors and wide-eyed decorators who spoke of light and modern lines, as if forgetting was a kind of renovation. No one asked about the woman who had once lived there, or about the flowers that bloomed even in dust. No one but Miss Marple. At her cottage, the seasons began to turn. On a pale March morning, she placed a small bird carving, wren-shaped and hand-carved, upon her mantel. Beneath it, in a thin glass vase, she set a single rose, clipped from the climber outside her window. Red as memory, it had bloomed too early, trembling with color and thorn despite the lingering frost. She looked at it for a long while, her hands folded in her lap. Miss Marple had never mentioned the bones she had found in the cellar, nor the note that had lain so quietly above them. She trusted me. I failed her. Some things, she knew, were not for courts or headlines. Some truths lived best in silence, not to be buried, but to be held. She had written no letters beyond the one. She had asked for no confession, but she had remembered. And in remembering, she had set something right. Because memory, like beauty, could be sharp. Because grief, like a garden, could grow wild if left unattended. And because justice, in her quiet way, sometimes bloomed out of nothing more than time, care, and a single watchful mind. Outside, the roses bent toward the light, as if listening, and Miss Marple, with her shawl pulled close and her gaze steady, watched them grow.